Rather than trying to define a good map immediately, I want to look at the different aspects that contribute to one. Only after putting those pieces together can we arrive at a meaningful definition. As I mentioned on my Streamslop article, I believe that Slop is a map where all the drops consist of only one pattern, and the pattern has no variety across the map or similar ones. So basically a repetitive map with only one pattern. I think it's important to say that good maps are not one-trick ponies. They usually have a main pattern and a secondary one. The two fundamental patterns of the game are jumps and streams. Most good maps will use them even when they aren't the main focus, and use more secondary patterns to make the drops more interesting. I made an entire video dedicated to Streamslops, and I think I raised a pretty interesting point in that video. After looking back on old maps that were repetitive streams, I played BPMRT again. I felt like I hadn't played it in years, though it's more likely that it had only been a couple months. When I played it, I felt a somewhat close sensation to when I played a Streamslop. I used to love that map, but now it was kinda bad. I don't think BPMRT is a bad map. It represents the song well and even has some interesting light vibro and some slides. For some reason, it felt somewhat close to the sensation of playing a Streamslop. I think that sensation comes from association. Since I have played so many Streamslops already, I have started to associate heavy stream maps with bad maps. And while BPMRT isn't a Streamslop, it is heavily based around streams, and that's what makes the sensation similar to the one that I have when I play Streamslops. The point that I'm trying to bring is that when you rely too hard on one pattern, even when it isn't a slop, it can sometimes, depending on the circumstances, feel like one. This isn't to say that BPMRT should have more jumps. Some songs generally call for one dominant pattern. The problem begins when the pattern exists because the mapper relies on it, not because the song demands it. When we talk about fundamental patterns of jumps and streams, I think one of the main things that comes to mind is how there are different approaches to a problem. I think there are songs that are better represented with streams and songs that are better represented with jumps, and that choice can highly change the gameplay of a map. I think that difference in gameplay comes not only from the obvious differences in pattern chosen to represent the song, but also how the secondary patterns bend themselves to complement the primary ones. That bend has a lot to do with how dense the mapper wants the map to be. So in a low density setting, for an example where you're making a jump slide, it's very unlikely that you'll be using a U-shaped slide. Instead, it's much more likely that you will use an I-shaped slide as it better complements jumps. If the secondary patterns don't complement the map correctly, they can make a map feel off or wrong. And so they're a big key to what I would consider what makes a map good. I think more than anything, the most important thing over what a player might argue is important is how the song is being represented. I think that a song dictates how the map would go. One very simple example of it is the BPM. Songs with very high BPMs usually tend to have stacked notes to properly represent those high BPMs. They usually tend to use streams as they have more notes than jumps. Meanwhile, songs that go slower usually need tricks to make them harder or more interesting. They usually benefit from a jump or a low density pattern. Hard for me to put into words when a song should be streams and when it should be a jump, but it's something that comes with experience as a player. Maybe mappers have figured out a way to categorically determine whether a song should be mapped at high density or low density, but I haven't really found a way to express it into words. It is interesting to me how the most important part of what makes or breaks a map is the part that I can explain the least. To better understand what a good representation looks like, I personally recommend playing good maps. You can ask more advanced players to recommend you things, or you can just look through the Ancillion archives where there are good maps for you to play. Ultimately, I think the best way of learning which pattern should be where is by listening carefully to the song and associating it with the maps that you have already played and seen. I just mentioned how representing the song is so important, but I think it is important to make very clear that one person cannot map all songs. People consider to be mappable is very different, but certain mappers simply cannot map certain songs. I think there are a couple songs in Soundspace I wouldn't really touch if I was the one to map them. Songs I didn't consider were possible to map. Songs like That Inside or Save You aren't ones that I would consider mappable, and yet they're not only in the game, but they're also maps that I really enjoy playing. Mapping is expressing the song, and when you cannot quite picture how a map of that song should go, it is almost impossible to make a good map out of it. Another thing that I have noticed is that the maps that I enjoyed the most rarely place their main emphasis on the vocals. They might still acknowledge them, but the gameplay is usually built around the instrumental rhythm instead. I think this makes mapping much easier because my first instinct is often to follow the lyrics, and that almost always results in a map that feels disconnected from the rest of the song. In all of the maps I've played, I don't think I ever found one that primarily revolves around the vocals while still representing the song, as well as maps building around the beat. Vocals are naturally less consistent than the instrumental foundation, which makes them much harder to use as the backbone of the map. The beat, on the other hand, provides a much more stable structure for the gameplay. Doesn't mean the vocals should be ignored entirely, they can still be emphasized or used as accents throughout the map. However, from my experience, trying to make them the primary focus almost always leads to a worse result than letting the instrumental rhythm dictate the gameplay. While most rhythm games have multiple things you need to do at once in order to beat them, in Soundspace you only need to move your mouse. And it isn't like you need to move your mouse super precisely, as the notes are pretty big and the entire gameplay is set to a 3x3 grid that isn't too hard to move in. Of course, there are Quantum that can make notes smaller or off-grids that give you a little bit more space to play, but ultimately you're kinda stuck with quite an easy platform. When the mechanics of the game are based on such an easy platform, you need to push the hard parts of the game to the maps and songs, meaning that you have way less wiggle room to stretch a slow song into making it hard. For a song to make a good map, you need to have a clear vision of what the map should look like in Soundspace. There simply aren't that many songs that fit. Though a lot of rhythm games don't have big songs because the community is small or because of copyright reasons, Soundspace suffered from another arguably bigger issue, and that is that most people cannot map most songs. There simply aren't many mainstream songs that people can map. When the map uses a main pattern it relies on, and when it complements harmonically with the other patterns, properly representing the song, emphasizing the things that need to be, with breaks that seem well put, without overmapping it, making it both playable and enjoyable, that is when I consider that a map is truly good. And while that seems like a lot of requirements, most of them are met without needing much thought from the mapper's side. I think if you ask me in a couple of months what a map needs to do to be good, I probably won't answer exactly what I just wrote. I think I likely won't be able to answer it at all, actually. But I never forget the feeling of finding a new map that strikes all of the chords you wanted it to.